My name is Derek Mitchell. I'm a former senior fellow here. I'm now a senior advisor to the Office of the President and the Asia program at CSIS. It's my pleasure to be moderating an exciting panel of good friends and a couple folks I'm just meeting now. This is, the entire session is about, or entire day is about looking forward. This is particularly about the new generation. And we'll have the new generation represented by the four to my left. Not that the folks in the previous panel are going to step aside anytime soon. They're also quite vital here at the table. Well, none of us are going to step aside necessarily soon. In Washington, you never do. But we have fresh perspectives here that really very interested to jump in. We talked, interestingly, this conference, we were talking offline, that we started very broad and then we went quite narrow in the last session of getting very specific about areas of potential cooperation. And I think we're going to go broad this time, go from the micro to more the macro and look at the overall political dynamics, the social dynamics, and maybe more of the constraints on the trilateral relationship, as well as the opportunities, but also where are the limitations. I come from that generation where this issue of US, Japan, Korea was kind of this lodestar. I mean, those of us who were, we started doing, when I was doing it in the 90s in the Pentagon, we just wanted to make sure the bilateral alliances were strong post-Cold War. We kept those fundamentals strong. And to make that the instinctive kind of thing, when we thought about the US and Asia, we thought about how do we work with our allies. And I think what's being done now, we always had this dream of kind of the quintessentially American dream of, since we have our besties in Asia, let's get those together and we can all be happy together. And of course, it's not that simple. But we have now an opportunity to, and I think it's a point of the Biden administration, is to make this trilateral normalized, to make this trilateral kind of instinctive. So when we think of the challenges of Asia, we think of the challenges of the world, of the Indo-Pacific, that we think, what can the US, Japan, and Korea do all together? So I think the Camp David principles, the outline of this really ambitious agenda, the conversation we just had at a very practical level before lunch of, the whole list, whether it's critical minerals or space, et cetera. It's a way to sort of embed that in our mindsets, that when we think about the big issues that we face, and that frankly we face together as countries and as allies, we instinctively think, what can the trilateral, these three countries do together? I think that's very healthy. But as you know, this is not easy. As stated at the end of the last panel, this is maybe exponentially hard to get allies to work together than it is just to do two and two, et cetera. So I want to have this conversation get into some of those next generation perspectives, some of those dynamics. And we have four wonderful people. I'll just go through the bios very briefly here. To my direct left is Yuna Jo, who is currently the David and Cindy Adelson Fellow in International Security at the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College and a fellow at Good Authority. She will be, though, an assistant professor coming into the government department at William & Mary. And she received her PhD in government from Cornell University in 2024. She has been a pre-doctoral research fellow at George Washington University here in Washington and a Morgenthau Fellow at the University of Notre Dame. To her left is Ayumi Teraoka. She is the incoming assistant professor of politics at Brandeis University up in Massachusetts, postdoctoral research scholar with the Weatherhead Asia Institute's Japan Research Program at Columbia, where she studied alliance politics and security issues in the Indo-Pacific. She's been a fellow with the Columbia Harvard China and the World program and taught a course on Japanese foreign policy at SIPA at Columbia. To her left is Adam Farrar. He's a senior associate non-resident of the Korea Chair here at CSIS. He is senior economics analyst for the Asia Pacific for Bloomberg Economics, where he's responsible for the organization's research and analysis on geopolitical risk throughout the region. Prior to joining Bloomberg, he served with the NSC staff from 2019 to 2022 as director for Korea and Mongolia, where he was responsible, among other things, for addressing the threat posed by North Korea. And most recently, he served as Special Advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris for all things related to the Indo-Pacific, space, and intelligence. And last but definitely not least, my good friend Laura Rosenberger, who has a really, she's extremely young and she looks very young, but a remarkable resume already. She is currently National Security Advisor to New Jersey Senator Andy Kim, who'll be speaking right after this panel, so stick around for that. And and during the Biden administration was a special assistant to the president and senior director for China and Taiwan on the NSC. Her last job with the Biden team was as chair of the Board of Trustees of the American Institute of Taiwan in Taiwan. And for those who are not aware, AIT was established pursuant to the Taiwan Relations Act and to manage the unofficial U.S. relationship with Taiwan. Before that, the Obama administration was chief of staff to a guy named Tony Blinken when he was Deputy Secretary of State, and before that, Special Assistant to Bill Burns when he was Undersecretary and was at GMF, German Marshall Fund, running an operation focused on securing democracy in the United States and abroad. So a remarkable resume, but an Indo-Pacific hand in and of herself. So a great panel, and I want to get to a discussion and get to audience questions as soon as possible and really get even some thoughts from the audience on the trilateral. We haven't gotten enough maybe from. But as an initial question, I'd like to ask each maybe an additional opening kind of salvo. Really looking at, maybe the first is the ties that bind, looking at the fundamentals. What are the things that underwrite this relationship? What are the things that will allow the momentum to continue? How sustainable is this momentum? We have a lot of momentum coming out of the Biden administration with infrastructure and vision. And also, what are the constraints, the obstacles that we see to sustaining that momentum in realizing the vision that we seek? So maybe with Yuna first, looking at the Korean angle, we'll go Japan and go down the list. So Yuna, to you.
Sounds great. It's a real pleasure to be here. I just wanted to begin by sharing a little bit about where the trilateral sits and then move into the momentum and constraints. I'm sure many people here will agree that the Yoon, Biden, Kishida trio really helped usher in a new sort of level of trilateral relations that otherwise may have been difficult if were not for the sort of personal commitments of these leaders involved. Trilateral cooperation to that point had been sort of maintained in the shadows, and under these three, it really came to a spotlight. But since their departure, I think the trilateral has been pretty much at a standstill at the topmost level. And there is a fair amount of anxiety that the ties that bind could eventually come to unravel. And I just want to briefly touch on what I think are the key constraints, and this bundle of constraints, I should call it, really comes from the leadership turnovers and the domestic instabilities underpinned by democratic erosion, especially in the United States and South Korea. So we know that Trump has these transactional tendencies and often focuses on relative gains wherever he can, even with allies and strategic partners. That in and of itself could put the trilateral at risk, where trust and not simply quid pro quo had sort of underpinned the relationship. Trump sees these alliances as burdensome, as unfair, and it's unclear who in the administration at the moment is currently championing the causes of maintaining, never mind bolstering, the trilateral cooperation. I think the picture in South Korea is a little bit more complicated. It's true that Lee Jae-myung's personal stance on the history issue with Japan and skepticism toward the quote-unquote strategic clarity as a grand strategy bode ill for the trilateral. But I think the bigger issue here is that it is increasingly difficult in South Korea for leaders to pursue policies that are against type. And what I mean by that is that certain policy issues that are entrenched in partisan politics get reinforced due to polarization. So despite his early intentions for pragmatism, he may end up pursuing narratives and policies that further politicize the trilateral and cooperation with Japan in particular. We've seen this in the ideological cycles of South Korean politics with Kim Dae-jung really being the only one who managed to successfully pursue counter-type policy on Japan. So I'll leave it to Ayumi to speak about Japan in greater depth, but my understanding here too is that the Ishiba administration doesn't have much political capital to spend on courting South Korea should there be a need to offer some sort of an olive branch, and that all bodes fairly ill. So Trump's disinterest in long-term strategic planning, the tensions in Lee Jae-myung's own track record on Japan and the desired course of action, and the internal fragmentation in Ishiba administration all means that there is less political cover for policies that could be highly unpopular among the core constituencies of the leaders involved. But that said, I think there are broader developments in the region that are pushing toward deepening cooperation between South Korea and Japan. First and foremost is the rise of China, and here perhaps I differ a little bit with what was said in the earlier panel. I do think there is a convergent perceptions of threat in South Korea and Japan regarding China. The other is a political disorder in the United States and the growing anxieties that South Korea and Japan share about both American abandonment and entanglement. These structural changes might pull South Korea and Japan together bilaterally, even if the trilateral might suffer with Trump's disinterest. But I think at this point, right now, leader-level signaling is really crucial to offer confidence to trilateral bureaucracies to continue cooperation as has been intended at the operational level. I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Cha and his whole team to organize this wonderful occasion, addressing really important topic that underpins the peace and stability of Northeast Asia and beyond. We have had 35 years of sort of the so-called post-Cold War period in which Japan, ROK, US tried to work as really three democratic allies in the region. And we have had ups and downs, but I believe that we are now entering the critical period of transition. And then what we do today will really determine whether we can harness this partnership in the next several years from the one that was sort of focused on trilateral cooperation that was led by the United States to sort of reluctant allies that are laden with historical animosity, but try to work together under the sort of guidance of United States and leadership of the United States that tries to work with a facilitator, coordinator of that cooperation to the trilateral cooperation that is really undergirded by three democratic allies really needing to work together to face the challenge facing those three countries. But in order to transition that trilateral relationship to more normal, sustainable, mature, rational, calculus-based partnership among three democratic allies, Tokyo would really need to overcome these challenges of managing leadership transitions in polarized partners of Asia, South Korea, and United States. From Tokyo's perspective, it's always great to have a conservative leader that is more pro-alliance and by extension more friendly to Japan. But after decades of trial and error, Japanese government officials and public do understand now that we can't just work with conservatives, we do have to strike a bargain with progressives in Korea. And without that, we cannot make this trilateral partnership into enduring, sustainable relationship. Where does Japan do this well? Japan does this well in the United States. Japan has, for a long time, committed to this relationship with the United States. So no matter who the leadership is in Washington, Japan has had, all these series of sort of dynamics and mechanism to influence U.S. government making to basically make sure that everybody in America, American people understand the value of alliance with Japan. And I think Japanese now have to really commit to advancing that approach in Korea to make sure that both aisles of Korean politics do understand the value of partnership with Japan and not let this partnership be the topic of domestic political contention within Korea. Yoon Suk-yeol's courageous leadership in opening up relationship again to encourage Japan to restart cooperation was huge plus. But it is in that way, it is the progressive government from Korea, Lee Jae-myung, that allows Japan to actually start transitioning that leadership, partnership into more bipartisan one with Korea. So this can be opportunity, really, to transition this trilateral relationship. And there are ample incentives for these partners to transition that relationship into a mature partnership. One is realism. External environment is very severe. I was just in Kyushu talking to people in the self-defense forces, and when they look at Western Pacific or Western region of Japan and security or Japanese borders, yes, they are increasingly aware of threats coming from China, but then they never forget about threats coming from North Korea. And they told me that, yes, Japan now faces threats on the two fronts, Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Strait, but it's actually 2.5 fronts because Russia, after the war in Ukraine, is tightening its relationship with China and North Korea. So now Russia really adds complexities because Russian fleet and military assets are also training with PLA around Japan and boosting capability of North Korea. So it's in order to face 2.5 front threats, Japan can ask for a better partnership in Seoul. For them, it's not really debatable whether we have to work with Korea. We do have to work with Korea. It's an indispensable partner. And then we do also have unreliable United States, increasingly capricious and trying to disrupt the economic regional order. So with ROK and Japan, I think have more incentives to work together to collectively bargain with the United States. And this partnership also extends to Australia, Philippines, and other US allies. Another structural factor I want to point out is this changing power dynamics between ROK and Japan. 1965, when they normalized relationship, ROK's GDP was Japan's 1/30th, and in 1990, ROK's GDP was still Japan's 1/10th. Today, I think ROK's GDP is between half or 1/3 of Japan's GDP. Japanese public is also now used to having really kind of departs from the status mindset of economic giant as its GDP falls from world's second largest to now fourth after Germany. So with that humbling experience of its power declining for a long time now, I think Japan can see partners on a more equal basis and look at ROK as really a powerful partner that Japan can work with. Second incentive or source of optimism is learning. After a decade of particularly tumultuous relationship between the two, I think both sides, Japan and ROK, do understand that they do not want to go back there. Japanese affinity level toward ROK went down to 26% in 2019. Now it got restored to about 55%. And progressives in Korea do understand that perhaps they went a little too far. And now, even though they are critical of Yoon Suk-yeol's diplomacy toward Japan, sometimes they call it humiliating diplomacy, but they still do value this improved public perception of Japanese towards South Korea. So they do not necessarily want to damage that restored relationship. Learning also happened on the Japanese side. Now that Japan does understand that we can't just be naively counting on conservative partnership, when the martial law was declared and it seemed like Yoon Suk-yeol was stepping out anytime soon, Japanese still continued on working level dialogues, trilateral dialogues that were institutionalized and did the business as usual, even if the prospect of progressive leader coming up was pretty high. Japanese reaction was that of calm reaction. And Japanese public government position today is that we will not prejudge what the ROK would do just because they come from progressive leadership. And that was the message that Seoul was also delivering to Tokyo, that we do not want to prejudge what the relationship will be just because leadership is coming from one party or not, because there may be actually a missed opportunity if we take such a rigid stance So I think both sides are open for a new way of working together, and there is I think, opportunity for that. Obstacles, yes, the trust was depleted during the 10 years of really fragmented relationship. So I think Japan is still taking pretty cautious approach of sort of a trust but verify approach. So Japan will continue to see what signals coming from South Korea. And then there may be less opportunity for leadership like Ishiba, who's domestically constrained to take bold actions. So I would encourage South Korea to also seek out partnership with various leaders in LDP who also have some influence over policymaking within Japan. Because Ishiba can be an incubator, but there are many other actors within Japanese domestic politics that will be influential, and it is in the benefit of interests of South Korea to seek broader consensus with other actors within LDP. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yumi. Adam, please.
So, it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be talking about something that I think is incredibly impactful for not only Japan and Korea, but very much for the United States relationship globally and its international position. I've spent much of the last week, like many people in DC, focused on Iran and Israel, and it is a welcome opportunity to talk about this very important issue. To build on comments already said, I think it's important to take a step back and look at one of the other key driving factors that kind of pushed the decisions that led to the historic meeting at Camp David. Obviously, you have this decision by personalities, the key leaders, President Biden, Kishida, and Yoon, Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon, to push this forward and put their own political careers on the line to do it. But at the same time, the geopolitical environment changed so drastically over the past 4 to 5 years that in many ways it put them on that path to make that decision, helping transition the thought process of the alliance in each of the countries, similar to what was just commented on, from this idea of a want, right? Wanting to see more cooperation, wanting to work together, to a need to do so. And as we look at each factor, you see the tension growing throughout this period. So as we start looking at China, the period was characterized by an increasingly aggressive, increasingly forward-leaning Beijing that pressured both Korea and Japan on multiple fronts and raised questions about the viability of those relationships that are integral to both of those economies. We had, obviously, assertive policies in the South China Sea and the militarization of that region. But more directly, we also had the introduction of China leveraging its massive economic power for coercion. And the impact of 2017 and the THAAD crisis, that while somewhat marginal in terms of overall financial impact on Korea, I think has had a real impact on the psyche and thought process of leaders throughout the region. The idea that China, on a whim, can turn off billions of dollars of economic aid, stop the flow of cultural content, and pressure a government to make national security decisions based on its own priorities, forced the administration in Korea and in Japan to think about how they could better posture themselves to defend against that. In addition, you also have unintentional crises where, in 2021, for example, China faced a power generation crisis and turned off the flow of urea into Korea, urea being a key input for diesel engines. This was not a decision based on malice, but rather one based on a core national interest in China, and that didn't even take into account Korea's interest. And so, yet again, Korea had a realization that they were exposed to this type of action at any time. Simultaneously, you also have the outgrowth and continued escalation of the engagements around the Senkaku Islands, with China asserting sovereignty and using physical force via its Coast Guard and maritime militia to push back on the Japanese, and escalating its nationalistic trend throughout its goals throughout the region. And that has not slowed, right? While we've also, just in the past year, we've now seen what is increasingly concerning activity in the West Sea or Yellow Sea, with the Chinese building an odd piece of infrastructure that they claim is related to fishing in territory that is well outside of their territorial waters. And Korea now looking to push back, but also reminding Korea on a daily basis that China will continue to push the bounds. On the DPRK front, we all know the story, right? When we go back to 2017, which feels like the height of tensions, we actually only had about 25 ballistic missile launches that year, including ICBMs. But in 2022, we had the better part of 100, right? Throughout that period, you had an escalation in rhetoric, an escalation in activity, and an escalation in threat from Pyongyang. And all of that reinforcing that Korea, Japan, and the United States had to find a new way to cooperate to try and address this new growing threat. On top of that, you also have Kim Jong-un moving away from the entire unification architecture of the North Korean regime, pushing back against the idea that unification would ever come about, and instead labeling South Korea as a hostile nation, all of which further reinforces the idea that a short-term or even long-term peace is even further away than folks had originally thought. In addition to those more traditional concerns, we have the emergence of DPRK Russia, right? With Russia's decision to massively expand its relations with North Korea in a time of need, when North Korea stepped in to fill massive gaps in Russia's ability to produce artillery rounds for its war in Ukraine, which has now exacerbated the question of North Korea's long-term technological capability. What is Russia giving North Korea? What will that mean for North Korea's ability to threaten the region, or its willingness to actually return to negotiations? Every single one of those dynamics has helped transition the mentality of leaders in each of these capitals to recognize that there is a deep need to engage and find ways to push back and demonstrate strength and deterrence against these threats. Now, in addition to all of that, we have to think about where we are today. I think while these issues all push in that relatively positive direction of trying to drive these three together, we are seeing slight changes that will complicate the situation. On the China front, we are seeing the emergence of a charm offensive, efforts to re-engage not only with Japan, but particularly with Korea. There's conversation about reintroducing K-culture to Korea, a key issue that was cut off during that THAAD crisis. There's expansive outreach to the new Lee Jae-myung administration, pushing them to kind of reorient and kind of reset and balance ties, which aligns with Lee Jae-myung's campaign promises. And with all of that, that presents a real question mark of where that relationship can go with that particular pressure point of the United States' insistence that both partners do more to curtail China. On the North Korea front, we have in some ways alignment, right? You have a liberal administration that is more interested in engagement, and a president of the United States that also has made no question of his interest in re-engaging North Korea. But he is also likely to do that alone and not engage North Korea or Japan as he does so, which inherently will increase tensions in the relationship and raise questions about the stability of broader trilateral cooperation. Thanks.
Thank you. Laura.
Great. Well, great to be here with all of you, and great to be here with my fellow panelists. Derek, you asked about the ties that bind, and I want to start there, and I want to just pick up on a few things that my fellow panelists have said, and I don't want to repeat, so I'll just point to a few things. I think we've heard about sort of two different categories of ties that bind. The first is the ties from within, the ties from among the three, and the things driving Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo together. And then there's the ties from without, the external environment, the turbulence that we're seeing globally, the forces from China, other forces in the Indo-Pacific, the forces from Washington itself, et cetera. Let me just add maybe 2 points to the ties from within. And I'm going to focus most of my comments on sort of where I think we should aspirationally be looking to go with the trilat. Anytime you're thinking about ties that bind in a relationship, the thing you want to do the most is thicken and broaden those ties and create as much stickiness, as much connective tissue as you possibly can. And I think we've seen a tremendous amount of that. But as others have noted, a lot of it has been driven from the leader level. It has been driven, in some cases, by particular political parties. And one of the things I think is incredibly important in all capitals is that we make support for the trilat a cross-partisan thing. Now, certainly here in Washington, there is bipartisan support for the trilateral relationship. And I know, just as an indication, you had Senator Sullivan speaking earlier. You will have my boss, Senator Kim, speaking shortly, a Republican and a Democrat, and they are amongst a large crowd of members of Congress who are very supportive of the trilateral relationship. I think it's really important that we build out that cross-partisan support in other capitals as well. I think there's been moves in that direction. But I think more work needs to be done there, and I think that's an opportunity for us to be working on that. On the ties from without, what I would add, we've heard a lot, and I would just agree with what's been said about the regional and global forces that are really driving the three together. I would maybe just also kind of take one more step back, which is to think about where the trilat sits at a moment of what I think is global reorganization. The entire order, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but globally, I think is seeing real tectonic shifts. And I want to see a future where the trilateral plays a large part of driving the Indo-Pacific part of that global reordering, and maybe even beyond the Indo-Pacific region, in a more stable direction. I think one of the dynamics that we are seeing in this realigning is, number one, a question of prominently who's going to shape what comes next. Is it going to be the United States? Is it going to be like-minded partners of the United States? Is it going to be China, Russia, Iran, North Korea in their configuration together, or some subset thereof? And I think it's decidedly in Seoul and Tokyo's interests for it to be not the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea crowd shaping the future of the global order, but rather for it to be some combination of the United States and our like-minded partners. And on that, I'd like to pick up on something that I think it was Ayumi who mentioned, the potential for the future, at least in the near term of the trilateral relationship, to look like a much stronger, frankly, bilateral relationship driving things between Seoul and Tokyo versus a relationship being more driven from Washington. We've historically seen the trilat as being more driven from Washington. I remember back in the days of working, frankly, on the six-party talks with my friend Victor, where it would be everything we could do to try to get the ROK and Japan in the room, the delegations in the room together along with us to talk about North Korea in the context of the six-party talks, right? We've come so far from that. And what I actually think would be a good thing is if there is a more equal parity of the sort of tripod of the stool of the trilateral relationship for Seoul and Tokyo to be equal drivers of where we're going. I frankly think that would be aligned with where I see a lot of the future of the U.S. sort of role in the world going, which is with greater parity with our allies and partners. It's certainly something that the Trump administration is pushing in their own, my personal view, destructive way of trying to bully your allies and partners into doing more. But I do think there is a need in the shifting landscape that we see globally for our allies to be doing more in concert with us. And I think it's very much in the U.S. interest for that to be the case. So I see real opportunity here for both Seoul and Tokyo to take the wheel even more in this relationship. I see it as very much in the U.S. interest for that to happen. And I see great opportunities for all of us to work together, not only regionally, but as we think about some of the global challenges that connect the Indo-Pacific and European theaters, for instance, to work together on that.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you all for, I thought, outstanding comments and great way to lay a foundation for the conversation. On that last point, on the issue of equal partnership, I mean, there are a number of ways, a number of directions we can take that question. But in my view, aside from maybe the trilateral, where Japan and Korea, they've had their problems, so the U.S. has had to drive to a degree, though I think ultimately the two worked it out themselves to get to Camp David. But in a lot of ways, I would argue, even during the Biden administration, that Japan was leading from behind, and they have for a time. They are the ones who did the free and open Indo-Pacific. They did the Quad. A lot of the initiatives well, even driven by Japan, and they were having their own thinking, driving us, and I think we're open door and all that stuff, but Japan is coming up with its ideas. Now you have the question of whether the United States, I think we have to get to that question subsequently, but to this equal partnership question, maybe in this instance, I'd ask on the Korea side, is Korea prepared for that? Is Korea ready to be an equal partner? I think Korea traditionally has been quite proud but insecure in a way, right? We want to stand up for ourselves. We're the small country among the whales. And most of the world now, certainly the United States, says, hey, you are big, you are great. Okay, culture, you've risen, the GDP is developed. Whether it's semiconductors, you go through it. And then Koreans tend to sort of, pull away from that. They talk about global Korea, but then they end up acting about North Korea, about the peninsula, and nothing further. Do you think the Koreans are ready? Do you think Lee Jae-myung, do you think the progressives, or the society writ large, maybe, is ready to be a more equal partner with the others to do more in the region and beyond?
Well, I certainly think South Korea is ready to seek equal partnership, and definitely wants that the respect and the agency in partaking in these types of unilaterals and multilateral engagements. I think on the key constraint there is what is the direction that different parties want to take things forward. I think there is quite an amount of fragmentation still in terms of what that direction looks like, and the public skepticism regarding public support for trilateralism, at the very broad level, it exists. But I think when you kind of dig into sort of the nitty-gritty concrete policy proposals, there can be areas where people simply don't agree that is the pathway in which South Korea should go forward. I think this kind of polarization is far less so in Japan, and maybe Ayumi can speak to that. So building and laying that domestic groundwork for whatever future it may be for that equal partnership is really where the key work needs to be.
Can you give a sense of those debates? What are the debates within of what Korea's vision is for itself between progressive and sort of conservative?
I think there has been some movement. So, we have seen during the campaign that Lee Jae-myung has been championing for a more sort of realist or pragmatic foreign policy, and that's sort of doing the counter type foreign policy. I will say, though, that if you look at public opinion, still to this day, support for cooperative policies with Japan, when you look at progressive partisans, sits still at about 28%. So when you have key core constituencies that aren't buying into the, for deepening cooperation with Japan, whether that's bilateral or trilateral forms, I think those are going to continue to be constraints for the progressive administration. That said, I think this is something I like to think about sort of counterintuitively, because the progressive presidents do not sort of suffer from the historical baggage that many conservative presidents do. If Lee Jae-myung is able to overcome the partisan constraints, then he may actually be at a better spot to pursue more lasting and enduring cooperation with Japan, because there will be less public skepticism over his intentions. And I think it remains to be seen how far and how well he'll be able to sort of manage the civil societal pressures for apology and reparations and domestic public opinion, as well as the sort of legislative side of things. But for now, the signs are looking promising.
Only Nixon could go to China.
Yeah.
This is what you're saying. Yeah. Adam, you want to jump in?
Just a quick point. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think there's lots of opportunity, but lots of questions about which way this new government will go, and certainly language that feels like it is turning more inward than certainly the last administration. But all that said, there are key external factors that are in some ways forcing Korea out, right? Pulling Korea into the conversation. And there's no place more where that more clearly occurs than in the technology field, right? Korean companies continue to lead in some of the most cutting edge and critical technologies on Earth, and as a result are in high demand everywhere. And so, that in some ways presents a great opportunity, right? Lots of opportunity in new markets, expansion of Korea's brand, right? The recognition of who Korea is in the United States has shifted drastically over the past 4 years, with hundreds of billions of dollars of investment by these Korean companies in those critical areas, particularly semiconductors and advanced batteries, all throughout the United States, not only bringing that technology and innovation, but also jobs. And in doing so, it puts Korea into the conversation on these big global questions, on the future of AI, on export controls, on how we're going to approach the expansion of these technologies in what is a poorly termed global South, right? And so in that way, Korea is being pulled into those conversations on a daily basis. It does, obviously internally, domestically create some division though as well, right? Because every time those companies invest abroad, every time they send money there, they're not investing in Korea. And there is some back and forth and questions about where that money should be going, which could lead to those who want to pull inward arguing for that. But I think increasingly these factors will kind of force Korea to the table and provide an opportunity and a platform for Lee Jae-myung to kind of elevate Korea globally.
Yeah, I think there is an economic interest-based case to make for global engagement of Korea, and Korean companies are already operating globally. And in addition to technology sector, Southeast Asia is the area where Japan and South Korea, I think, can work much better way and much more coordinated way. I think much of the U.S.-China competition as we speak is about really kind of winning hearts and minds of Southeast Asian countries. That is really the force for growth in Asia. And if you combine direct investment that Japanese companies and South Korean companies make, it far surpasses China's investment in the region. So I think there are many ways that South Korea and Japan can still coordinate and sort of coordinate on their strategic communication about what U.S. allies can do in South Asia, East Asia, where U.S. administration might be less interested in engaging those regions, is even more necessary today. And I think if the new president in Seoul, Korea, Lee Jae-myung, is kind of taking pride in being pragmatic, I think we can make a pragmatic case to him that it might be a way for South Korea's growth and achieving global vision as a proud South Korean government.
Yeah, I think the goal of the Biden administration was to make, as I said, to make this trilateral institutionalized. They talk maybe privately Trump-proof or whatever it is, or whatever comes later proof. And maybe that's a question. Do you think that, because we are heading into choppy waters in all capitals in one way or another, potentially, does this need summits to be driven at this point? Do you think there is enough there? As you say, I think Laura, many of you made this point that and Adam, that there are external drivers that are driving them together, internal drivers probably pulling them apart to some degree. So there are structural factors internally and externally. I mean, it's heart and head, it's emotions versus realism. But they have now the vision, there's now discussions on this whole host of things that we talked about in the earlier session. What if there weren't summit meetings? What if it wasn't driven from the top? Can this still gain momentum, do you think? Simply by the private sector or by the need on energy, et cetera. To what degree does it still need that push from above, would you say, in coming years? Laura, do you want to?
I'm happy to kick off. I certainly hope to continue to see leader level meetings. Let me start with that.
Yeah.
I think had President Trump not departed the G7 early, we certainly were hoping to see that there. Right. I do think it's really important that Lee Jae-myung and Prime Minister Ishiba did have a bilateral meeting. I think that was important in and of itself. I think the fact, frankly, that you do have a number of summit meetings on an annual basis, assuming the United States continues to go to those, that both Japan and Korea are a part of. So obviously the G7 with Korea continued continuing to be invited. NATO with the +4 from the Indo-Pacific attending, having both of them there too. I think there's a number of opportunities, even if it's not the kind of Camp David-like summits, to still have leader-level meetings that are maybe smaller ambition, but still keep things going at that level. I think that's important, and I certainly hope that we can maintain that. Now, in the absence of that, do I think things can continue? Yes, but I do think that having that blessing from the top, even if it's not with a long list of deliverables or big vision statements, is a really important piece. But the other piece I'll say, putting on the hat of where I sit now in Congress, I mean, there's other parts of governments that can keep these things going too. And I think the legislatures can and should play a real role here. And I think that there's opportunities to do more on that front. We have a lot of bilateral exchanges. I think thinking about some trilateral exchanges and dialogues would be really suited for the moment, and another way of keeping that momentum and thickening the ties as well.
And doing it on a bipartisan basis, that shows it's a model for the other countries to bring your parties to the table too, so it institutionalizes it politically.
So I agree fully with how Laura described it. I don't think we should foreclose on leader level engagement. I think there's actually, when you look at how the Trump administration is thinking about its policies towards China, well, there's certainly some question about which direction we're going on any given day. The direction of travel is generally clear in terms of trying to compete more, pressure more, and find ways to, in some ways, decouple. And in that storyline, engagement with Korea and Japan is essential. And I think that argument can be made at the most senior levels from his staff, from President Trump's staff, that having a meeting, maybe without the long list of deliverables and without the deep preparation that has gone in the past, but even just having that meeting sends an important signal. And it increases pressure, and it's another tool in the toolkit to move forward on this broader China policy. So that, I think, is one, is that there is reason to push forward. And that same driving factor, I think, we will see at other levels of government, particularly in the Department of Defense. And as they seek to expand posture and change posture in the Indo-Pacific, while there are going to be deep tensions, right, lots of questions about the future of U.S. forces on the peninsula and the role of U.S. forces on the peninsula. In general, though, the idea of engagement with Korea and Japan and expanding that cooperation, better aligning missile defense in particular, a key outcome of the summits during the Biden administration, all play into that objective. And so I have some faith that the system will keep pushing. The last thing I will just say, though, is that it will take more from Korea and Japan pushing the United States for things to be in the trilateral format. And so, as was already described, I think Japan has tried to do that itself and will likely continue. There are questions about what the new Korean government will do. But I will point that just yesterday there was a trilateral air exercise involving all three air forces. And so the apparatus knows how to do this. The question is just how long it will keep going. But with pushing from Korea and Japan, I don't think at the working level the United States is going to push back.
Right. Reverse Gaiatsu, as it were. We need it now more than ever to push back.
Yeah, I also think if new government in Korea wants to engage with North Korea in some ways, I don't think Japan or U.S. is completely opposed to that, right? I think that Japan and U.S. are more willing to kind of seek new way of dialogue with North Korea in new creative ways. They haven't really decided on what kind of trajectory they want to seek, but I think having that platform to actually constantly engage in dialogues among the three countries so that one wouldn't go too far away from the other two, I think it's going to be actually really critical. And all the institutional platforms that Biden administration led to create will be very helpful in constantly check at different levels that one is not going too off from other two partners.
Right. Let me ask the broad question on generational change. This is what topic of this panel is about in essence. But looking at it on the ground, maybe you've done studies on history and memory and generations and gender as well, given the polarization in Korea. We've seen the recent elections and a lot in that front. How does that play into this? Do you see anything in the poll numbers and the dynamics at the popular level along those lines?
Yeah, I think the conventional narrative tends to depict generational change as a positive force for both bilateral and trilateral relations with Japan and the United States. I personally think it's a little bit more complicated. The new generation in South Korea itself is very divided ideologically, and we've seen this in the last snap election, but also the last regular election. You also see that many young women, even in sort of pro-conservative strongholds in South Korea, turn out for progressive presidents. As somebody who studies social movements, I attend a lot of protests and demonstrations on social and historical issues, and you do see, and just based on my own experience, that a lot of these events are driven and participated by young women. So I think the question of how the generational change will figure into trilateral dynamics really depends on whose voice is going to be heard, who is mobilizing politically and for what. And we don't, there are so many hosts of factors that can determine that. So generational change can have different sort of directions and pull and push factors for trilateral.
Right. Yumi, have you thought about this question?
So generational divide in the case of Japan is not too clear, but I mean, the public polling generally suggests that people in 20s and 30s have the highest affinity level toward Korea because they lived with K-pop and Korean culture within their lives. But in people in 40s, 50s actually have the lowest view toward Korea. And actually, the seniors, people senior than that actually have a little bit more nuanced, moderate views toward Korea. But one thing I would say is that still overall Japanese public affinity toward Korea is generally higher. When we think about trilateral cooperation, we often think about Obuchi, Kim Dae-jun's statement to be the height of the relationship. At the time I look at the public perception, only 45% of Japanese were having affinity toward Korea. Now it's about 55%, and in 2010 we had even reached 60. So actually, when we had a highest level, leadership level joint statement in 1998, public was not too integrated. Now I think people-to-people ties actually are much deeper, connected at a much deeper level, and we cannot discount that. And then I think it's a stability, forceful stability.
I'd like to open it. There are several more questions to ask, but I did want to open it up. If people have even comments, I mean, there are young Japanese and Koreans, I think, in the room, or others who want to provide their own perspectives or questions, absolutely. There's one over there first? Okay, and then we'll come over there. Please. Just introduce yourself.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Karol Białek, and I'm a student and researcher at University College Dublin, Ireland, but I'm actually Polish. But I was having a question. What, in your opinion, Korea and Japan, which should have what attitude would have towards cooperation with its European counterparts? Because I'm just curious, because I was looking very often that in Europe a lot of the countries within NATO wouldn't even pay 2% on their military budget, which I'm happy with Poland paying almost 4%, and it's planned to pay 5% next year. So just curious what would be the attitude of Korea and both Japan towards cooperation with European counterparts. Thank you.
Right. Did you catch the question then? Engage with Europe, please.
I can start with your question, particularly on the defense angle. We've done some recent writing at Bloomberg on this, but as many of you are tracking, Korea has invested heavily in expanding its defense industry and its defense exports. And one of the largest contracts it's signed and is delivering on is in Poland. With the provision of a very large number of self-propelled artillery, tanks, and some aircraft. The progression that you're talking about opens up lots of opportunities. The pressure from the Trump administration on Europe, particularly in defense, but across the board, requires a reevaluation of the relationships that Europe has that define its key industries and its key markets. And I think all of those should point to Korea and Japan. Now, I think we haven't seen that transition fully, or moreover, it is a slow process. But I think increasingly, Korea on defense, but on kind of key industries, trade with Japan and Korea will need to play a larger role as to some extent, Europe seeks to de-risk from the United States. And on defense itself, what Korea brings to the table, and to some extent now Japan with its joint program with the UK and Italy for a sixth-generation fighter, is an alternative that provides high-end advanced technology that has deep experience operating with American technology, but also provides it at a lower cost point and with technology transfer, which is key for production being drawn back into Europe and redefining and rebuilding the European defense industry.
Any other thoughts on the Europe angle?
I can just add maybe 2 points. I mean, one is I certainly think the potential, I think Japan in particular is already doing a tremendous amount with Europe, and I think we saw a real shift in that. I mean, I think there was already a strong foundation of that, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Prime Minister Kishida's, real strong public stance on that, really talking about the sort of one theater concept, I think really brought that home. And so I think there's a solid amount of connectivity at the political level and more broadly there. I think for both Korea and Japan, in addition to what Adam said on the defense side, talking about in the technology space, the role that each of them plays in terms of semiconductors in particular, with tooling and with the chips themselves. I think an increasingly important role in connectivity there. And there's a number of different formal, informal configurations in addition to the trade piece that Adam mentioned that I think will drive that. And then I think, again, kind of zooming back out to a question of sort of global reordering and who's going to be shaping things, my sense is that there will be a tremendous amount of alignment between Seoul, Tokyo, and a lot of European capitals on the direction of travel of wanting to shape the sort of next decade or two. And so I think there could be a real opportunity for increased cooperation there.
But it's interesting how Kurt mentioned this morning that the new administration is questioning this issue of binding Europe and Asia together, of linking the two as one theater.
It's a strategic mistake.
I completely agree. The question is, Japan and Korea may still continue because they see value. There is practical value. There's still an interest, whether it's corporate or strategic in other ways. So again, one of the ways that this stuff may have been started that would be much more difficult to stop in spite of U.S. leadership or lack of U.S. leadership. So viable stuff. Please, yes. Nope, the other gentleman there. Just around further, yeah, to you. No. Okay. Sorry, we'll get to you beyond it, sorry.
Okay. Thank you all for sharing insights on trilateral cooperation. I am Sherry Chen, and as part of the next generation, my peers and I will take on the responsibility of safeguarding international security. And now I have a question for Ewan and Ayumi. How do nationalistic sentiment and historical memory shape the young leaders' perspectives on the trilateral cooperation, and what might need to be reconciled? Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for that question. I think the issues of historical memory, I think, shouldn't be taken as constant constraint on cooperation. I like to think of it more as a narrative resource in South Korea that can be tapped into by different political actors. Given South Korea's history, I think there is a reservoir of anti-Japanese sentiments that political actors have tapped into for both good and for bad. That said, public sentiments, public mobilization does not always lead to undermining cooperation. We've seen certain moments where that has happened. So we can think of, for instance, the public mobilization against GSOMIA under Lee Myung-bak that was foiled at the last minute. We can also think about how the Comfort Women Agreement became co-opted in broader contention against Park Geun-hye during the last stages of her leadership. But these are sort of more episodic. So I think sort of broader generalized feelings toward Japan don't tend to accurately capture the kind of underlying reservoir of anti-Japanese sentiments or discontent. And those are the things that have to be managed at the political level, and where I think leader level signaling is particularly important.
So I haven't done the study of this, but during the 10 years or more of really worst time in between Korea and Japan, there was also anti-Korea sentiment within Japan. There was a lot of books on sort of anti-Korea, or sort of books advocating South Korea passing. And then in that time, Japan also developed partnership with other U.S. allies, and Japan pretended that those U.S. partnership with other like-minded allies can kind of replace Korea, but it turns out Korea is not replaceable. I mean, in order to really manage threats from the Korean Peninsula, Australians and Filipinos can't do the same work that Korea can provide. So I think we have passed that phase, and I think there's no longer sort of much appetite for that kind of publications. I think that's toning down. That said, younger generation Diet members I think they have a very flat view on facts and then sort of interests that Japan has with Korea. So I think it'll be easier for newer generations of leaders to kind of build trust between them based on the sort of facts-based analysis of what their interests are.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Is it working? Yeah, it's working. Go ahead. Close.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, my name is Matthew Bragg. I'm a recent graduate from St. Mary's College of Maryland. I want to steer a little bit away from the military security part and talk a bit more about the human security part. Mainly how this trilateral cooperation can enhance not only just education, job opportunities for people from Korea, Japan, and the US, but also medical opportunities that they can have. Because this cooperation, I think, can help a lot of people who just couldn't have those opportunities before if these countries didn't cooperate. So do you guys see any progress made towards that direction? What is it going to look like in the future?
Anyone seen trilateralism in medical and health realm? Certainly seems logical. We've seen it around, I guess, the pandemic in terms of supply chains in a very corporate way. I think it's a good idea. There's no reason why they couldn't. I don't know that there's been any work on that quite yet. But
the only thing I would say is that inherently you're correct that these people-to-people ties underpin the entire relationship. And when we've had momentous moments in the trilateral relationship, a lot of those deliverables, a lot of the things that have been brought to the table is finding ways to expand those cooperation in fields across the board. But certainly in this moment with the current administration, it's unclear how many of those in and of themselves as programs will continue. But that said, clearly there's growing relationships between each of these countries, and I take solace in the increased travel between Korea and Japan that's increasingly reported, and the large number of Japanese and Korean students that travel and study in the United States. But I think trilaterally, we haven't leveraged that tool, that structure in that way.
Yeah, I think the agenda is broad as we talked today. There could be a whole host of things that we can do together if there's a choice to do it, there's a will to do it. On the human dignity side, human rights, on housing political prisoners or people escaping from, whether it's Hong Kong or Myanmar or wherever it is. The question is, where is the United States on all this these days? And then how much is there willingness in these capitals? So I think there's a lot on that agenda. The sky's the limit. The question is what these countries will take up and how much bandwidth they have to do that. Where are the priorities they want to place? If they have a limited amount of time to talk about something and prioritize something, what are those priorities? And we have time maybe for one more question, one or two more questions. One more? Okay, let's go over here. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm biased to that side because I'm pointed that way, so I figured I should turn this way. It's my left-wing tendencies.
Is it on? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk and panel. My name is Tony. I'm currently an undergraduate student at Wisconsin-Madison. Now, obviously, we're on the topic of next generation, and when we're talking about the younger generation, especially in the context of Japan and South Korea, the one problem we cannot avoid is their demographic problem. So I'm extremely curious. Yes, the U.S. is somewhat experiencing it too, except we do have immigration that's keeping our population numbers up. Do you guys think there's a potential cooperation effort between South Korea, Japan, and U.S. to tackle the demographic situation in South Korea and Japan? Thank you.
Big issue.
Did you say democratic or
No,
demographic?
demographic.
Okay,
Yeah.
demographic.
We have a democratic problem too.
That
Go
too,
ahead.
yes. They go hand in hand. I think demographic issues are sort of existential for South Korea and probably also for Japan. I think there's a huge need for reform in immigration policies, but the key constraint there is the underlying sort of national narrative of what constitutes Koreanness, a lot of which I think are sort of historical legacies of the Cold War and the national identity issues that we have. So immigration policies in each context have to be reformed in order for them to both survive economically, but also for there to be political stability. Where like the trilateral cooperation can help with that, I have not considered deeply enough, but that seems to me to be a core issue for the trilateral going forward.
I think there's opportunity for three countries, but particularly Japan and Korea, to kind of work together on sort of automation technology and how to use that to replace some of the manpower that we may be lacking in the future. But I also see that there may be more competition between Korea and Japan over talents, attracting talents globally, especially on semiconductors. So I think there's a limited pool of talents in the world, and sometimes we may be seeking same group of talents from globally. So, but healthy competition's also good. So I wouldn't rule that as only a source for instability. But I think because two countries share same demographic challenges, I think more intelligence, information coordination or cooperation will be, I think, force for good.
Yeah. Imagine two American friends, maybe not, comment on demographics in Korea and Japan. We are at time, so I've been given the signal we have to wrap up. 0 minutes, it says right there, so I guess that means time's up. Just a couple concluding thoughts. First of all, wonderful panelists for today's session. Look, when I went online, I was thinking about how do we sustain this relationship over time, and I went online to look for and to download a copy of the Camp David Principles, and it switched me over to whitehouse.gov, and it said page not found because the new administration has taken it all off. But that's a bad sign. But it is true. I don't want to. We talked a lot about constraints and internal constraints and external maybe facilitators here. I think at the working level, there's a lot driving it. A lot of things externally. Realism says these three countries should be working together. They have so much overlapping common interest that they should be working together on some of these really critical issues. And as many issues these days, we have China to thank for much of it, for pushing countries together. But it's got to be based on more than that. But I think that we can see momentum continue over time. And it needs, again, to be quite instinctive. The one big question we haven't, the one big variable now is we haven't hit a stress point yet. It hasn't been stress tested. We had a really great run of the three right leaders at the right time with the right staffs, in the White House and elsewhere. But there hasn't really been a hard stress test. And that will be the real challenge, is what happens if, just taking the United States, if, as we talked earlier, there is a pull out of some troops. What if we do push for strategic flexibility off the peninsula? Well, there's more pressure on things like Taiwan, or you can go down a list of issues, and then of course on historical issues of the World War II end coming up, and there are all kinds of things that can stress test. But I think the key is people in this room, people in this panel, people within the governments who recognize that this is really critical. And regardless, we have to persist through the choppy waters and see it through at every level because it's in our interest. Normative interest, our values, but also our strategic interests. So I imagine there'll be many more conversations like this at CSIS and elsewhere. We're very, very thankful to you for coming, and please join me in thanking these panelists for coming. And what now? Back at 2:30. 10 minutes. For Senator Kim.
Is that rain outside, or do you guys have some sort of water feature?
Oh my gosh, it is rain outside.
Okay. That's crazy. I was like literally just outside. I was like, do you guys have some like
it's our
waterfall
fountain,
that's like
our rooftop fountain.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you everybody. You could all take your seats. Thank you all for joining us for our session with Senator Kim. Thank you all for joining us with our session with Senator Andy Kim. We are really delighted that he could take the time out of his busy schedule to be with us this afternoon. I know he's very well known to all of you. He's kind of a rock star for this audience, but let me properly introduce him. Well, first I should introduce myself. Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics here at CSIS, Professor at Georgetown, and we're very happy to welcome Senator Andy Kim to join us today for our discussion on the future of trilateral relations between the United States, Japan, and Korea. As all of you know, he is the United States Senator from New Jersey, an office he has held since 2024. Prior to that, he spent 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing parts of Burlington, Ocean, Mercer, and Monmouth counties. He is the first Korean American in U.S. history to be elected to the United States Senate, and New Jersey's first Asian American senator. In the House, he was a member of the House Armed Services Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a member of the House Small Business Committee, and also worked on the Select Committee on the Coronavirus and Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the CCP. Before being elected to represent New Jersey's 3rd Congressional District, he worked as a career public servant under both Democrats and Republicans, having served at USAID, in the Pentagon, at the State Department, on the White House National Security Council, and in Afghanistan as an advisor to Generals Petraeus and Allen. In the United States Senate, he is a member of 4 committees: the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, where he is a ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security and International Trade and Finance. He's on the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. Senator Kim is a former Rhodes Scholar from Magdalen College at Oxford. What was your major?
I did a doctorate in international relations.
Wow, that's intimidating. He did a doctorate in international relations at Oxford?
It's a very thorough bio, by the way. It's just, do you need my SAT scores or something?
He's a proud husband and father of 2 children. He's also a Philadelphia Eagles fan. We can talk about that later. Please, a warm welcome to Senator Andy Kim.
Thanks, Steve.
So, Senator, just to get us started, I've heard you in different venues talk about the role of U.S. alliances in our foreign policy. And I was wondering if you could start off by just offering us some general thoughts about that, particularly as it relates to the Indo-Pacific region and, of course, the topic today with regard to Japan and Korea.
Yeah, happy to. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to CSIS for hosting. But I think that question about alliances, about coalition building is critical right now more than ever to talk through. Because we're entering right now a new era of global politics. This is a new era. We're so clearly no longer in the post 9/11 world. We're entering into a new era that includes, but isn't solely described by great power competition. But basically, we're entering an era that many in America have never fully experienced, which is a multipolar world. And as a result, in this era, I think the United States now more than ever needs to think through what are our strategic advantages. And I believe that one of the most important strategic advantages that we have as a country is the ability to forge alliances and coalitions. Now, some of that requires modernizing NATO and existing alliances and try to meet the moment, and we've done that in the past. There was a redefining of NATO after 9/11. We can do it again. But it's also about forging new groupings. And I think that in particular with the Indo-Pacific, that's important because there's no NATO of the Indo-Pacific, nor necessarily should there be. But there needs to be some understanding of how it is we can come together and to be able to talk through. And I think that's particularly important for America because we like to call ourselves a Pacific nation, but we don't always live that out. And I think that these coalitions, these abilities for us to gather together with some of the top partners, that helps us try to flex that muscle. Get used to the idea that, yes, our identity doesn't have to be predominantly defined by a transatlantic identity. We do have the capacity to be able to have and build up a Pacific identity. And I think that that's something that we see with the Trilateral, with the Quad, with other types of efforts. And I think that that's going to be incredibly important.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. As you said, there is a lot of unprecedented disruption in the world today. Well, wars in Europe, in the Middle East, tariff wars, the growth of this axis that many speak of China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, all of them having supported Russia's war in Ukraine, for example. How do you see sort of the U.S. role in this disrupted order, and where do our allies like Korea and Japan fit into that?
Yeah. Well, I can't stress enough how much the invasion of Ukraine has shifted that order. And I know it's easier to kind of contemplate when it comes to Europe, but you cannot deny the impact that it's had on Asia. I think, for instance, the North Korea-Russia connection is something that really stands out to me. You see basically just over the last 2 years or so, you now have North Korean troops in Ukraine fighting for the Russians. You have, I think, about roughly 50% of munitions that Russia uses provided by North Korea. You see an unprecedented amount of money, upwards of $20 billion of economic support coming from Russia the other way to North Korea. What this has done in many ways is just kind of realigned East Asia, certainly the Korean Peninsula, by making it such that North Korea is no longer predominantly in China's orbit, it is now predominantly in Russia's orbit. It means China has less influence on North Korea. It means that we have less influence, South Korea has less influence, and we don't know where that's going because A, we don't know what's going to happen with the Ukraine war. We don't know whether or not Russia is going to continue to provide support or whether that relationship can exist beyond the Ukraine war. But right now, North Korea is feeling like they're in a fundamentally different place than they were a couple years earlier. When COVID was unbelievably difficult for them to navigate. Prior to that, the talks with Trump in the first administration, that all seems like a century ago now. And so that realignment is something that I think it's important for us to think through. And again, we don't understand just how much cohesion there is between those four nations you talked about. I don't think they know, but they're in some ways getting kind of backed into it in different ways, but it's tested. In the same way that we don't know what's going to happen with Iran, whether diplomacy or more kinetic action, that's going to have an impact on North Korea. So then you bring in South Korea, you bring in Japan, you bring in the Trilateral. Well, how does that kind of fit in? Well, I think fundamentally it redefines it in the same way that it should redefine the U.S. military mission in South Korea, in the region, because of this shifting weight. I think it reinvigorates and actually creates a greater fuel for the impetus that created the trilateral to start with. I think there's even more of a reason why the US, South Korea, and Japan need to be more closely working together as we're seeing this emergence of a stronger North Korea-Russia tie, a greater uncertainty about China's role in that trajectory. And I hope that, from our standpoint, the idea is that, yes, we live in a multipolar world, as I said, but I think we could benefit from having a more multipolar Indo-Pacific, a place where, where South Korea and Japan are not going to be overwhelmed or overshadowed about just what's happening with China. And I think the emergence of Russia as a bigger Pacific player, again, they're a nation that as well has their identity shifted in different directions. Are they more of a European nation or an Asian nation? And as we're seeing their gravity being more pulled towards North Korea, it's making them more of a Pacific player. It has to encourage us to be a greater Pacific player too.
Right, well said. Could I ask you, so as we all know, South Korea recently concluded a very important presidential election. What do you see as some of the opportunities for deepening cooperation, with this new government in South Korea, and with Japan for that matter?
Yeah, well, look, first and foremost, I congratulate President Lee in terms of the election. And look, I don't envy him. Coming into an incredibly challenging moment in Korean politics. And I say that going full well through a lot of challenges in domestic politics here in the United States. Both of our nations have gone through a lot. And I think first and foremost, the priority on both of our sides needs to be about economic security and economic opportunity. That is the mandate that President Lee has to follow up on. That is the number one thing on the minds of people there. It is still the number one thing on people's minds here too. It's just that this administration doesn't always act like it, and the issue of lowering costs here in America seems to take a back seat to just trying to have political domination on the domestic and the international fronts. So I'm hoping that this is an opportunity for both nations to try to re-engage with that priority at its core and not get pulled into all these sort of deviations of that. There no doubt that we've seen the news of the Trump administration thinking through what to do with troop level numbers and things like that. I think that that's a perfect way to derail this relationship at a critically important moment. I think that the next couple of months are vital, to really solidifying U.S.-South Korea relations with these two new leaders to see which path it goes down. And I think that's going to set a lot of tone in terms of how the U.S. is going to engage more broadly in the Indo-Pacific. So I've encouraged this administration to hopefully engage in these conversations as soon as possible. I was disappointed that President Trump left the G7 before he was able to have a sit down with the new president. But I'm hopeful that they can go on. And I've kind of relayed, again, you need to treat this new administration, both sides need to treat each other with respect. And hopefully they can be able to move past, some of these initial, obstacles that are in their way. But this is a very treacherous moment for this. I hope it goes well, and I'll certainly do everything I can to try to make it go as smoothly as possible.
Can I ask you just one follow-up on that? And that is, if you talk to folks both in Tokyo and Seoul right now, the number one issue when it comes to their bilateral relationships with the United States are the tariffs.
Yeah.
Right? And so I don't know what your thoughts are on that in the context of this broader, very complicated environment in which we need allies like this. How do you look at this?
Yeah, I look, in some ways this goes back to your first question they asked me, which is about the importance of alliances. I gave my answer. But I'll be honest with you, my answer appears to be very different than what the Trump administration's answer would be to that question about the importance of alliances and partnerships and coalitions. And I think that that's some of what is fundamentally at risk here and why we are having the battles that we're having here in DC about what our posture is. When I look at the Trump administration's foreign policy, I don't see chaos like a lot of people talk to me about. I see a very coherent implementation of what appears to be a neo-isolationism policy, something that is reducing our relationships down to transactional relationships. And, when I asked Secretary Lutnick about this in a hearing, I said, are you going to, this was before all the terror started when he was in his confirmation hearing, I said, are you going to treat allies and partners differently than adversaries and competitors? And he basically said no. I think that's a huge mistake. And I think that this is, something that's causing unnecessary friction between us and our allies and our partners at a time when we have real strategic challenges when it comes to competitiveness, not just with China, Russia, and others. But we also have this brand new technology that is emerging right now. So not only do we have a new era of global politics, but we have a generational moment of technology that is very much up for grabs with AI. And this is the wrong time for us to be causing this type of friction. So, yes, it's deeply problematic. And I'll just say this one last thing. The problem is that it is turning America from being the indispensable nation into being the unreliable nation. And that affects us in so many different ways. Who is going to want to be in greater security cooperation with the United States if they deem us unreliable? Who is going to want to invest in American businesses or to headquarter American businesses in their capitals in the Indo-Pacific if we're deemed unreliable, unpredictable, chaotic? And so, that is the challenge that we're facing right now, and why it's so important that we don't let our relationships with South Korea and Japan go down that path. Because if the United States is unable to maintain a strong working relationship and a partnership with South Korea and Japan, two of our strongest partners for so long, what kind of signal is that going to send to nations in Southeast Asia and elsewhere around the region that don't have the economic might that those three nations have and the history behind us? And so I think a lot of countries around the world are looking towards the Trilat as a barometer of America's commitment. And if we can't commit to South Korea and Japan, who the hell are we going to commit to? And I think that that's why it's so important as well.
Interesting, very interesting point. So let me shift a little bit to, we've talked about the U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Korea relationship, our commitments to our allies. Let me ask you a little bit about Japan and Korea. I mean, so this month is the 60th anniversary of the normalization of relations between Japan and Korea. And at least the initial statements coming out of the Lee government, the Ishiba government have been positive, generally positive, about continuing strong bilateral and trilateral cooperation that was started under previous administrations, as you said. I mean, where do you see opportunities for Congress to engage and to help build sort of this three-way and bilateral relationship?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying, the fact that the leaders on both sides there are signaling openness and interest in continuing, that's good. That's good in and of itself. I mean, when I came into Congress, 6.5 years ago, that relationship was really at a low point, and I think sort of we always have to keep in mind the delta of what has happened. I mean, this has been one of the most remarkable sort of connections that we've seen over the last decade. But that's a good thing. It has the opening. Now the question is, how do we make sure that this new round of leaders can make this their own? They don't want to just continue this off the inertia of their predecessors. That's not going to give them a sense of satisfaction. There needs to be a redefinition of this, a sense of ownership of that. And so that's what I'm going to be looking towards, to try to get a sense of what are their priorities, how can this embed in. I think certainly on the economic side, there's a lot of interest across all three of our nations when it comes to supply chain, especially supply chain resilience in a way that can better secure. On the broader security front, yes, I think the questions that we talked about in North Korea certainly is of concern, but also I've had very strong conversations with leadership in both capitals about cybersecurity, about next-gen technologies. And especially when what I was talking about with this innovation curve that we're in, this is the steepest innovation curve I've ever seen during my lifetime. And there is a real race on this in terms of the buildup and proliferation of AI technology. And each of our nations can complement one another incredibly well. We would benefit from working together to build the same AI stack, all of us joining in partnerships that can very much stand as a counter to what we're seeing proliferating out of China. So I think that there's a lot of win-win-wins. And I'm hopeful that we can continue on. Now, from my standpoint, I'm certainly continuing to encourage the executives on all three countries to stay engaged, and I will do so. But I do think that there's a greater ability for me in particular. I've been talking about how to start this up in maybe an interparliamentary way, trying to think through how can we make sure that between the National Assembly, the Diet, the U.S. Congress, we can be sharing and building relationships and partnerships on that front. And I think that will benefit too, because, by nature of our institutions, we are ones that are more public facing, try to make a stronger case to the public why this partnership is important and to be able to bring it together. Also, each of us represents different geographic parts of our own nations, and we can try to build partnerships between states and provinces and other areas. So I'm intrigued by how that could potentially take it to the next level. And look, certainly for me personally, I feel very invested in trying to be a bridge between the United States and the Indo-Pacific. In particular, this is my top priority when it comes to foreign policy and something that I hope to be able to build on for some time to come. Yeah. So I'm gonna personally invest a lot into trying to build that relationship up and solidifying it so that it is something that is durable and isn't just based off the whims of individual leaders. Yeah. I mean, that's really great to hear. I mean, your point about sort of the legislative exchanges is really important because, as you mentioned, some of the issues that we're talking about, supply chain security and some of these other things, I mean, they really require coordination of pretty detailed legislation on all three sides. I mean, the executive branch can sort of make pronouncements, but it's the Congress, the Diet, the National Assembly that have to write the laws and the regulations that allow for that. So that's really great to hear. You mentioned this earlier, Senator, in one of your other remarks, but I just want to sort of ask you a separate question on this, and that is this question about the U.S. troop commitments. There, as you know, there has been some discussion, at least from the outside, some press reports that have been written about a potential withdrawal of U.S. troops from Korea. Perhaps brigade size of U.S. troops from Korea. It's not been confirmed one way or the other. The administration has said that the story is not true. But I think many in the D.C. think tank community believe these ideas are under study. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? What does that mean in terms of our commitment, and perhaps even more importantly, what does it mean for deterrence and preparedness vis-a-vis North Korea and China? Yeah, I mean, look, used a word that's at the heart of so much of what we talk about in national security, which is deterrence. And that certainly has an important role to play, but sort of the opposite of that is also important. Right now, there's a time for assurance as well. This is a moment where the United States needs to provide assurance about whether or not we're going to live up to our responsibilities and our roles. And when it comes to this 70-year alliance with South Korea, the idea that the United States would unilaterally make a decision of that magnitude and that the South Koreans might read about it in the newspaper, I mean, that's irresponsible. it's disrespectful. And I said that directly to senior leadership at this in the Trump administration. Don't surprise South Korea. Don't surprise our allies. They deserve to have respect in that. There's a lot there that we can think through in terms of modernizing this alliance, modernizing our partnership. I don't discount the idea that we can be having conversations about strategic flexibility or about OPCOM transfer or other types of things that are important. But they have to have a conversation about it. If we just make, the Trump administration just makes unilateral decisions upon this, springs it upon the South Koreans, it'll be, first of all, something that is seen as I said, disrespectful to the alliance. But it's also going to be something that just weakens whether or not other countries, again, want to partner with us. It's going to hurt our ability to move forward. It does nothing but embolden our competitors and our adversaries. So, I hope that there can be a conversation, in the same time that we're talking about tariffs and the economic aspects, they should be able to have a broader conversation as well that brings in some of these other elements so that we ensure that it's being talked about and brought out into the light. And I think that's certainly something I'm trying to do from the congressional side, is to just bring that into the light. I have a better understanding of what this administration is considering. Have they thought through the repercussions? Have they thought through how it will be perceived by those that are friendly and unfriendly? And I think that that's something I don't currently have confidence in terms of how this is being done and orchestrated. So that's what I hope transpires in terms of that more open process here in DC, as well as between capitals, to be able to engage in that and hopefully come up with a mutual decision on what's best.
Right. So you're saying that there are ways that the administration can carry out a plan with regard to the force posture in the region that could be in the context, well, first, more transparent, more consultative, but particularly in a context that is about modernizing our alliance relationship rather than simply saying we're pulling out some troops, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I've been focused on that idea of modernizing that relationship. I wrote an op-ed about this before the state visit, talking about how, as we celebrated the 70th anniversaries of these, of the alliance and of these different aspects, that we can't just be backwards looking. We have to look at the next 70 years. What does that mean? And it means that we shouldn't be looking at this solely through sort of a military security partnership, but now really embracing what we can do when it comes to our economic security, the innovation, how we can build upon that. I still believe in that, and I'm hopeful that we can open up the conversation in that kind of way. And when I look at Trump, when I look at Lee, I see some possibilities there where, where they can potentially build off of what each other wants and, be able to try to execute this. And so I've signaled to the White House, I told them, look, if you're going to be thoughtful about this and strategic about this, I'm ready to be somebody to engage in bipartisanship about South Korea, about Japan, about the Indo-Pacific, because just too much is happening. We cannot ignore it for a couple years. I have to engage because so much is unfolding right before our very eyes. And I think it's going to be critically important.
Yeah. I remember that op-ed. That was an excellent op-ed. If I could just ask you a little bit about yourself now, just as we get towards the end of our time together. As I mentioned in your bio, you are the first Korean American in U.S. history to be elected to the U.S. Senate. So that is truly a historic accomplishment. Could you just reflect on how, what that means for you? How, if at all, how you've thought about that? And then also, do you have plans to go out to the region, to Korea, Japan?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's a humbling experience to, when I was getting sworn in, to have my parents in the gallery at the Senate, watching me raise my right arm, to have my kids there, to have 3 generations of my family in the Senate chamber as I'm getting sworn in to be the first Korean American. I'm the first Asian American in the U.S. Senate from the entire East Coast of America. I'm the 10th Asian American ever in the Senate. I was sworn in by the 9th Vice President Kamala Harris. It was a lot. It was a lot to process. I'll be very, very honest with you. I did not do this to set out to break this barrier of being the first Korean American, but I understand the importance of that for my family, for my kids, for the Korean community in the United States, as well as, for South Korea. And I am trying to think through, what does that mean? What is the role for me? I'm still grappling with that and understanding where I can be of most impact. I think what's important for me is to approach this with some humility. I don't have some perfect agenda that's going to, set out for the Korean Peninsula or for the Korean American community. But what I do think I can play a role on is hopefully being able to get the Korean American community and the Asian American community more engaged in politics here in the United States. When I think through the struggles that I've seen in terms of getting the American government, Congress, the executive branch to focus more in on the Korean Peninsula, on the Indo-Pacific, as I told you, the challenges of this nation embracing its identity as a Pacific nation, I think part of what's going to unlock that is to have greater participation, greater engagement and voice from Asian American communities, from Korean American communities talking about this. I see how other diaspora groups are very effective in terms of agenda setting in Congress, in the executive branch. I don't see as much of that. When Trump was considering the talks with North Korea, in his first administration, I saw zero outreach to the Korean American community and I was the only Korean American in Congress at the time, and I reached out and said, I'm happy to engage. Zero interest in talking to me. So I'm hopeful that we can find a greater voice, and I think that can benefit more broadly. I really do. I hope that we can recognize the power that is there, and also that so much of what's going to happen right now is about society to society relations as well. So much of what is being driven is, business to business, people to people, university to university. There are other ways in which we can strengthen ties between the United States, South Korea, Japan, and elsewhere. We don't have to just sit back and wait for some 10-point plan released from the State Department or the White House. There are ways in which we can do this in a different vector. So I'm interested in exploring that. And yeah, look, I hope I'm hoping to get out to South Korea with, potentially this summer, if not shortly thereafter. I got a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old, though. I'm trying to balance, just
take them with you.
Oh yeah, you gonna babysit them on a 17-hour flight, I'm trying to figure out how best to be able to navigate that. But I do want to get out there, and I'm eager to just step up and figure out how I can be of help, because like I said, this stuff's not going to fix itself.
Senator Kim, you've been very generous with your time. Your comments and perspective on U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific, U.S. identity as an Indo-Pacific power, and the value of alliances really is invaluable. And we really want to thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks, Vic.
So please thank Senator Kim for joining us.
That was excellent.
Oh, and so we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Yeah. So I forgot.